Hello and welcome. My name is Brandon Moose, and today we're going to be doing a deep dive into what are autonomous vehicles driving in a city near you. So, autonomous vehicles. You may have heard about them, and you may have asked yourself a few questions like, what are autonomous vehicles? How long have they been around? How do they work? Are they safe? And if you give any of those questions some thought, you may have come up with some more in-depth kind of questions, like will there be increased integration in various cities or metropolitan areas? Am I going to have to interact with one of these things? What companies are using them? And how are we regulating all of this? Those are all very good questions, and what we're going to discuss today as we learn about autonomous vehicles. So, what are autonomous vehicles? Well, loosely, they are vehicles equipped with technology that senses the conditions around it. These could be cameras, different radars, things like that, but anything that a vehicle may use to determine its surroundings. So, currently, the Society of Automotive Engineers, or SAE, has defined 6 different levels of autonomous vehicles. Now, roughly broken down, levels 0 through 2, the driver remains in control of the vehicle. Level 3 through 5, the vehicle is self-driving. So levels 0 through 2, again, the driver remains in control. At level 0, this is your basic warning level technology. Blind spot monitoring, lane keep monitoring, things like that. The car is not doing anything other than giving you a warning that, hey, you're, drifting out of the lane, or there's somebody that's next to you. When you get into levels 1 and 2, you end up having some active controls being handed over to the car. So you could have something like adaptive cruise control. It's a very common feature in a lot of modern cars. You could also have active lane assist. And so those are dealing with 2 different functions of your car. One is steering input, the other being throttle and brake input. So level 1 is when those 2 items are separate. Your car does one or the other. Something like an active braking for an emergency collision avoidance. Level 2 is your car does both. So it has lane keep assist and active braking, or and adaptive cruise control. So those 2 levels are extremely common in new cars. So when you hear autonomous vehicles, these fall in that classification. So you're already exposed to this technology. You just may not have realized that it fell under that umbrella. Most people hear autonomous, we think self-driving, but really, all of these modern amenities and modern safety features that have been around for, even on mid-level models for a decade, are considered autonomous vehicles. Then you get into the levels 3, 4, 5. This is where things are a little bit more ambiguous, but in levels 3, 4, and 5, the car is driving for you. Level 3, the car is driving, but you are expected to take control if it requests it of you. So Tesla is a great example of this. They have their full self-driving features. They're in the news the most. People are probably most familiar with their offerings, being on the highway, and the car makes you keep your hand on the steering wheel to maintain a presence, but it can drive you. Other items would probably be something like higher level adaptive cruise controls with lane keep that can bring you all the way down to a stop. And then the car says, okay, I've stopped, now it's your turn. you need to tell me what to do next. Um, and then you get to levels 4 and 5, and then this is where you are expected to have no input. Level 4 is a minimal. There are restrictive conditions under which this vehicle can operate, but in those conditions, it can operate fully and by itself. Then you have level 5, and basically the thing can operate by itself in any condition, in any circumstance. And that is just full self driving. You know, a lot of the robo taxis and things like that haven't even reached that yet. This would be a car that could do anything that a vehicle piloted by a human can do. So, how long have autonomous vehicles been around? Well, the idea of them has been around a lot longer than you may think. So, even as far back as 1478, yeah, 1478, Leonardo da Vinci was actually hypothesizing about self propelled carts that traveled along a predetermined path. And, you know, how do they use a predetermined path? Well, we think of sensors in terms of technology these days, but sensors can be mechanical as well. A following stick that senses a groove in the road and then uses mechanical leverage to adjust the cart's path. You know, that is a form of sensor. It's just not a um, electronic sensor. And then in 1939, GM introduced a self-driving car that used embedded metal spikes within the roadway, and then radio-controlled electromagnetic fields for guidance. Basically, they would remote control these fields that the car would be steered along. And then things really started to pick up. 1977 was probably the first modern kind of interpretation on self-driving vehicles. In Japan, they were utilizing cameras on cars to image and process their surroundings. And then we get into the 2010s, and now we're really getting into what we're familiar with in terms of self-driving or autonomous vehicles, where multiple manufacturers are investing heavily in technologies to make cars that can operate themselves. And how are they doing that? How do these things work? Well, in today's day and age, we're using a variety of sensors to help these cars process the world around them. So the common ones are going to be radar, LiDAR, and then your standard cameras. Each one of these has drawbacks and advantages, be it, you know, limitations from visibility, you know, low visibility and fog, or true line of sight, nighttime versus daytime. You know, an actual camera needs a light source in order to create these images versus radar that's using radio frequencies and things like that that are bounced off an object, and then they interpret that to give objects position, relative location, speed of approach, and things. And interpret, how do we do it? We're now using AI software that interprets this data and chooses a course of action. AI, it's kind of synonymous with machine learning, and I think that's the key here, is machine learning. So basically, they've built these softwares that have parameters that are open-ended, and just like a human, or, you know, a person that's driving a vehicle, it doesn't just get in and know how to do it. It has to learn. The good news is it's almost like a hive mind, where once the software learns, it can be applied to multiple vehicles, where we each have to learn how to drive a car individually. So, and in this instance, you have live testing that is done with these AI softwares in first controlled environments, and then with a test pilot in live environments, and things like that, that allow the car to gather real world live data, make decisions, and then see the outcome of those decisions. Typical cars are going to have multiple sensors mounted around, 360 cameras that are really commonplace these days. Some manufacturers like Tesla are really trying to stick with camera only technology, and that's just to help keep costs down. Radars Um, Not the most expensive, but has its own challenges from a design standpoint. And then LiDAR is a very expensive technology in terms of cost to manufacture high quality precision units. So, in order to, companies like Tesla, in order to make this more within reach of more people, are trying to develop systems that rely on a lower price point sensor. So, a great question when you hear Tesla and all of these things. They're in the news for the good, they're in the news for the bad. And so everybody wants to ask, are these things safe? I drive around every day. How do I know that I am safe when I'm on the road and these cars are out there that don't have anybody driving them? Well, in terms of level 0 through 2, um, I don't think anybody questions whether or not these technologies are safe. I think everybody feels like they have made the technology or driving a vehicle much safer. I'm going to splice this together. So, cars that are on the road with the 0 to 2 level, again, yeah, they're safe. They're safer because of that. I think it's when we get into the 3, 4, 5 levels that people start feeling uneasy. Um, and I kind of liken it to almost, people say flying in an airplane is less risky than driving a car. I'm one of the people that flying makes me nervous, and presumably it's the lack of control. And so we feel in control when we are in the driver's seat, and to relinquish those um, decisions to a machine that is marginally tested compared to the entirety of um, how long people have been driving cars, how long we've been designing cars and road signs and intersections and cities to work for people. Now we're asking a machine to do it. Um, you know, and it gets down into how many crashes are deemed acceptable. If you hear about one crash for self-driving cars, that does that turn it off? I mean, how many crashes are people involved in every day? And so, at what point are we considering them safer than a human piloted vehicle? So the NIST is developing a an operating envelope specification, basically a set of rules or criteria with which to judge these self-driving cars. Um, you know, we've figured out how to test a human driver fairly well. We all take driver's tests, driver's education courses before we're allowed a license. So now they're exploring, how do we test a software driver of a vehicle, and just determining what's the best questions to ask, to get the answers that we want. You know, and then our self-driving crashes under more scrutiny than self-piloted cars. Um, they're not commonplace. And so anytime you have a new or novel um, event happening, especially one that's technology based and involves real people with real tragedy, it's going to gather a lot of attention. You would not have enough time in the day to read about all of the traffic accidents that occur in the U.S. on a daily basis, much less worldwide. Um, So it's already fighting a small bias. But that being said, they do happen, and it it begs the question of who's taking the blame for this, because the the design companies, in some instances like Tesla, you know, they only go up to this level 3 um, autonomous driving, sometimes level 2. And in those instances, you are expected to be observing and maintaining control of the vehicle, um, ready to take over. And so they push all the blame back on the driver. And it's counterintuitive when they're touting these technologies as these safety advantages and um, luxury advantages for the driver. But we've got statistics from two of the leading robotaxi companies right now, Waymo and Cruise, that show their vehicles, they're averaging about one crash for every 60,000 miles. 60, yeah, that's one crash every approximately 4 to 5 years of driving for a human driver. I don't typically get in a crash every 5 years, um, but when you break into the statistics, the majority of these crashes were extremely low speed and many times the fault of the other driver. And they are including in this data things like vehicle bumped a shopping cart in a parking lot, or vehicle curbed a wheel, or anything else that's minor, probably had no to minimal damage, um, but it's an incident and it's one that they track. However, when you don't view this statistic in that context, um, you think it's really bad. But if you step back and look at it, okay, once every 5 years, you probably make a minor mistake, running a tire off the road, hitting a curb, nicking a shopping cart, getting too close to something and bumping it, even if there's no damage. And you brush it off as these things happen and you don't give it a second thought. That's not to say that these companies haven't had more major incidents. Tesla had a fatal crash in a car that was in their full self-driving mode where it failed to stop. Waymo and Cruise have had a couple of more major incidents. I call them major, or I put it in quotes here just because while they are major and worth reporting to the federal database for these sorts of things, um, they're still not 6 car pileups on the highway. One with Waymo where it hit a dog and killed the dog. And that's something that animals are just so unpredictable. It's hard to place the blame in that instance on the vehicle itself. So, as we are moving forward with all this, one thing we are definitely seeing, especially in the major cities and metropolitan areas, is an increased adoption of these autonomous vehicles, these self-driving vehicles, level 4 vehicles, pushing towards level 5. So you have Google's parent company, Alphabet. Their self-driving division is Waymo, as I mentioned earlier. So it was originally launched in San Francisco, but it's quickly being adopted in other cities such as Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Austin. Um, this is in a matter of just a year and a half to 2 years. So that's a very fast adoption over a large geographic footprint, and it's only going to increase. You have companies like Zoox that was acquired by Amazon, originally a startup, and they're looking at initially testing their self-driving vehicles for their employees, using them as shuttles around their campus, um, getting them to and from work, things like that. And you also have Tesla, who had just unveiled their robo-taxi, and is currently courting various cities, trying to get it implemented. But there's a few different challenges with that we'll discuss in just a second. So, more cities, more companies, that means more chances for interaction. And so as these companies launch self-driving programs, you have a higher and higher chance of interacting and sharing the road with one. And you just have to continue to step back and look at what the data is showing you, and ask yourself, how uncomfortable does that make you? It's one of these things. There is a lot of automation that goes on behind the scenes that we don't give a second thought. And so, try to put bias aside and see if this is something that you should be worried about or you should be excited about. Because it's coming, and there's a lot of new companies that are um, developing this tech and pushing it into our lives. So robo taxi services seem to be the um, initial market that everybody's really pushing into right now with this level 4 self-driving. I think mainly because it's a contained area, they have limited operating areas, um, and it's a service that people need. You have established companies already in the game: Cruise, Tesla, Ford, Waymo, and then you have new companies that are developing the technology or potentially exist in other global markets that are attempting to bring their technology into the US. Companies like Baidu, Mobileye, Hyundai, Volkswagen Group, Yandex, and then Zoox, as we mentioned a second ago. Some of these companies are Korean and China-based companies, specifically China, which has a huge EV market right now. But political tariffs kind of prevent those from being sold in the U.S. What's interesting here, though, is it's a very different concept to sell a vehicle in the U.S. than it is to own a company, make use of existing vehicles, um, and just utilize the technology. Because if you're not selling a good, you're selling a service. So with their backing, we may see them really step up and try to push into this market. But all of these things, what Tesla's going through with the various cities, um, what Waymo is finding as they face pressures anytime they have an incident, with these foreign companies are finding as they try to come in the market, is that there's a lot of regulatory challenges, not just for them, but for the people that are making these rules as well. And it's because technology is just advancing so rapidly, and policymakers, they can't keep up. Policymakers have mountains of red tape, they have large scale impacts to consider, and oftentimes by the time you've really done a deep dive, become familiar with a topic that you're not an expert in, um, but need to make a critical decision on, it's out of date. This technology advances so fast that it's almost impossible to make a decision based on current informations without incorporating some projections that may or may not come to fruition. So because of that, we still lack effective regulatory systems that assure public safety. Um, some of that's because people have a false sense of safety in the technology, which prevents people from acting too quickly. They inherently think that computers are less prone to mistakes than people, um, forgetting that it's people that code them, it's people that test them. There's still people involved, even if they're not the ones driving the vehicle. Um, and there's a lot of crash data that suggests that even SAE level 2 and 3 autonomous vehicles suffer the same challenges that human drivers do, with visibility, poor conditions, new conditions. There's a almost infinite number of things you may encounter when you're driving a vehicle, and it's a human's ability to rationalize and have novel thoughts about a situation that allow us to make a decision in that moment. Whereas these AI-based softwares um, are using probability statistics and learned algorithms. And so when they encounter something new, we're more likely to get a unforeseen behavior out of them that makes them unpredictable and potentially dangerous because they wouldn't respond in the same way that we would expect a human to do. But there's just a lot of disagreements on policy, which has led to stalemates in policy. In the Senate, there was an Endless Frontier Act that was supposed to have a umbrella coverage for self-driving and autonomous vehicles and their implementation, testing, how they would be, who would be held liable on the streets. Unfortunately, that failed, and so now we have states stepping up in filling that void with local laws and regulations, but it's creating a patchwork of policies for these manufacturers to follow, which is making it very difficult for them because they can't They can't keep track of all these different policies and all the different jurisdictions and come up with a product that will work for each. So you see them kind of picking out the major markets, developing within those markets, but then it can be hard to translate markets because you may have to follow a different set of policies when you get there. So now we know autonomous vehicles are vehicles that use sensors to perceive and respond to their environment. The concept has been around for much longer than you probably thought, dating all the way back to 1478 and Leonardo da Vinci with his original concepts. And although they are generally safe, they are not foolproof. They face the same challenges and limitations that we do regarding to sensory input, and potentially making an erroneous decision in a emergency situation. We currently have 6 designated levels of autonomous driving from the SAE, ranging from zero tech all the way up to 100% self-driving, no human involvement needed. And companies primarily are currently using full self-driving robo-taxis in a lot of the big cities. More companies are implementing this technology and in additional places, which is only going to increase your chance of being exposed to a self-driving vehicle. And policymakers are struggling to enact overarching guidelines for self-driving vehicles, leaving it to the local authorities. This is slowing progress as manufacturers must contend with varying rules and regulations. So now that you're educated, do you feel better about self-driving cars? The same? You know, I started my research in this and shifted my opinion as I learned more. So I'm interested to know, how do you feel about this? Do you mind sharing the road with these? Would you take a ride in one? I think I would. Thank you.